And since the mu'min has no anxiety about provision and shelter, his commerce is, as we have already seen, based on giving out in the knowledge that whatever he or she gives out will be returned by Allah 10 times over. There is no need for the Muslims to amass capital in the way that the kafir banks do, because their capital is the generosity of Allah, which is limitless. There is no need for the Muslims to borrow and lend on interest, because Allah's return on any gift made in the name of Allah is far higher than any interest that anyone could hope to charge. That is, the equivalent of 1000%. There is no need to manipulate people by getting them into debt, because since the body politic of the Muslim community is unified, there is no body of people within it who seek to control and manipulate and exploit the others. The only elite in the Muslim community are the awliya, whose stations are greater than the others because they fear and love Allah more than the others. It is because of their great knowledge of Allah, and therefore of how existence works, that they know that the more they serve the others, and the more they give out in the name of Allah, the more Allah will look after them and give them what they want, which, in their case, is not other than what they need. Muslim commerce is based on used and on giving out. It is dynamic and free-flowing. There is no need for Keynesian control techniques. Kafir economics is based on exploitation of others and retention. It is static and stagnant. It stinks. As Omar Ibrahim Vadillo points out in his book, Islam Against Economics, Islamic law defines the parameters within which trade and business will be just. Economics defines the parameters within which an economy will be more efficient. Islamic law and economics are totally different approaches to existence that create two different ways of life. Islam rejects usury, while economics is based on usury. Economics has managed to justify what is Islamically a crime. This is possible because economics has a methodology and an object of study which covers up the inherent injustice of usury. In other words, economics can neither properly analyze, nor identify the nature of usury. And as Omar Ibrahim Vadillo concludes in his book, the workers how been told a lie about their own situation. The only way out of the usurious system is Islam, because only Islam is government without state and commerce without usury. The age of Judaism and Christianity is over. Only by understanding that there is no God but Allah can the people stop worshipping useless, perishing things like the state, money, and their job, and be free. Only by accepting Muhammad is the messenger of Allah can there be justice in the transaction. Islam or economics, Laslam or the banking system, this is the decision everybody will have to make. It is clear from this analysis that there is no such thing as a halal Islamic bank, as Umar Ibrahim Vadillo observes in his book, The End of Economics. The so-called Islamic bank is a usurious institution contrary to Islam. The fallacy of the Laslamic bank is an absurd attempt to resolve, as was done in the case of Christianity, the unswerving opposition of Islam to usury for 14 centuries. Since its origin, the Islamic bank has been patronized and promoted by usurers. Their only intention was to incorporate the 1,000 million Muslims of the world, who in general would scornfully avoid using any banking or usurious institution, into the international financial and monetary system. The artificial creation by the colonial powers of the so-called Islamic states, itself a contradiction in terms, whose character is markedly anti-Islamic, was the historical result of the end of territorial colonization and the beginning of financial neo-colonization. The universal establishment of the Western constitutional model, the model of the French Revolution, brings with it the establishment of artificial and unnatural boundaries, the creation of a repressive ministerial bureaucracy, the exacting of taxes, the imposition of an artificial yet legal money, and the legalization of usury itself. The banking system, all measures which are profoundly contrary to Islam. The Islamic Bank is nothing other than a typically degenerate producer of the so-called Islamic states. And as Omar Ibrahim Vadillo concludes in his book, Fatwa on Paper Money, the founders of the so-called Salafiyya movement or modernist movement were first to declare publicly from a recognized position, like the University of Al-Azhar, that the use of banking was halal. The implications of this declaration can be seen in our day with the implantation in the Muslim lands of the Islamic Bank. The Islamic Bank is a completely usurious institution used as a means to lure the Muslims who still reject the banks to enter in the banking system. The Islamic Bank is a Trojan horse in Dar el-Islam. Given the dynamic nature of Muslim commerce, it comes as no surprise to learn that the value of money in the time of the first Muslim community of Medina al-Munawwara was based not on how much gold or silver it could buy, because their money was gold and silver, but on how much gold or silver was needed to buy a given volume of grain. Since grain was readily available, unless there was a severe drought, and could be grown by anyone, it followed that it could not be used by either withholding it or fooding the market with it to make the value of money fluctuate. In the way that the artificially limited gold and silver markets of today are manipulated in order to raise and lower the apparent value of today's worthless money, almost at will. This meant that the basic value of money, in other words, its purchasing power, remained stable in Medina al-Munawwara, and accordingly, there was no such thing as what the Kafirun call inflation. Furthermore, since the taxes required by the Quran are so low, it followed that there was no stimulus to make people raise their prices in order to beat the effects of the taxes. As happens in today's modern, so-called advanced kafir state, accordingly prices remained stable. And so again, there was no inflation caused by rising prices. Furthermore, since it is not permissible to make more than 30% profit on essential goods, the Muslims in that first community did not raise prices to high out of sheer greed. If they feared Allah and the last day, which they did, since the value of money was stable, and since prices were stable, it followed that incomes were stable. So there was no inflation caused by excessive wage demands, as happens today in the so-called modern kafir state. Finally, since Allah expressly forbids the charging of interest, saying more than once in the Quran that it is haram, and will take you to the fire if you indulge in it, it follows that there was no opening for the kind of business institution which today lives off other people's indebtedness to it by charging interest. Allah says in the Quran that the first community of Medina al-Munawwara was the best community that has ever lived on the face of the earth. It follows that in order to know how to live, it is necessary to see how they lived. Having seen this, it is possible to apply their way of doing things to the way we do things today. The kafir argument that their way of life is now out of date, and does not and cannot apply to the 21st century, is palpably weak. The scenery and the props may change, but the human situation remains the same, and the way of the first community is the best way of dealing with it, and it will remain so until the end of time. Following the way of the first community of Medina al-Munawwara does not mean religiously imitating their way of life in every detail. It does not mean having to abandon today's technology, where that technology can be usefully used, and used with the discrimination between what is halal and what is haram. The way of the first community was based on what is in the Quran, and on the example of the Prophet Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, who was described by his wife, Aisha, as being the Quran walking. Records of that example still exist today, both in the Quran and the Hadith collections, and in human beings, notably the Awliya, who had the existential way of living of the Prophet, and the knowledge which goes with it transmitted to them, person to person, from the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the fierce community up until the present day, without a break in that chain of transmission. The nature of the Quran is such that the guidance in it can be applied to any situation, where there is no specific mention of what to do in the situation in which you find yourself. It is still possible to see what to do by doing ijtihad. Ijtihad is the process whereby you see what to do in the light of what you know, of what is in the Quran and the Hadith and the way of Muhammad. To begin with, it is a conscious thinking process. But as the heart becomes more finely tuned and illuminated, ijtihad becomes a reflex action. You know what to do and what not to do in the moment, and without having to think about it. If you are not sure about something, all you have to do is open the Quran, and you will see the ayah. That is the sign which contains the answer. Thus, it is not only Muslim commerce which is dynamic, but the whole way of life in whatever sphere. The nature of phenomenal existence is such that there is a constant and dynamic interplay of many opposites, which is always in motion and never exactly repeats itself, even though patterns and cycles are clearly recognizable, are part of that interplay. You are not separate from it. The way of Muhammad, may the blessings and peace of Allah be on him, and on all who follow him, is the way of knowing what to do in that interplay so that you never fight it, but go with it. By living in this way, you arrive at knowledge of Allah, from whom this interplay of opposites originates, and returns not only in the very beginning, and at the very end, but also in every moment. By living in this way, you arrive at knowledge of yourself, and you find that the whole of existence is yourself. And whoever knows their self truly knows their Lord, Allah. When you live in this way, and with this knowledge, then you are a human being, who acts with humanity, and with humility. You are pleased with Allah, and Allah is pleased with you, and in this state, you enter the garden. The result of the way in which all the kafir subsystems and institutions in the kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, work and operate, is to depersonalize and dehumanize the human transaction. Where in the past people used to give to each other, now, they charge each other for services rendered. Where once common sense, generosity, wisdom, flexibility, and above all humanity, used to characterize human transactions. Now, the rules of the various systems which together form the Dajjal system are often applied with automatic and unfeeling inflexibility, even when the outcome is patently ridiculous. The complementary descriptions which are used to affirm and promote the system do not in the least accord with what is actually going on, as conditions in general steadily continue to deteriorate. The more citizens' charters and other official guarantees there are, the less people are treated like human beings. Patients in hospitals are now called customers, and people in general are now called consumers. The words, the conditioning, the programming, the explanations, the reasons, all of these are no more than a web of illusion which has been spun by the controlling elite of the kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, the Freemasons, so that they can entangle and enslave the many, as they struggle to free themselves. The kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, uses people until they are of no further use to that system, and then they are discarded. People are given numbers and treated like robots, because machines are much easier to control than human beings. Machines submit to whatever you do with them without complaint, provided they are kept in running order. There is no need to behave like a human being towards a machine, because machines cannot respond like humans. You just use them until they have come to the end of their working life, and then you get rid of them and carry on with their replacements until, that is, the time comes for you to be replaced as well. It is only possible to treat people like robots, because half the people in the kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, already are robots. The so-called people who are completely happy with the kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, are people who have been taken over, are the living proof of the manifestation of Dajjal as a worldwide social and cultural phenomenon, and Dajjal as an unseen force. Will be the people who recognize, support, and follow Dajjal the individual when he appears, will be for the fire. The people who abhor the kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, are the human beings who have not been taken over, who, if they are not already Muslims, will be Muslims, inshallah, who will recognize, support, and follow the Mahdi when he appears, who are for the garden. You belong to either one group or the other group, and there is no third group. You cannot extricate yourself from the creational process of which you are a part, and which is based on the dynamic interplay of opposites. There is no escape. Turning your back on the problem will not make it disappear. Hiding your head in the sand will not change who you are, but will merely make it extremely difficult to see where you are ultimately going. There is no hyperspace button to press and magically transfer you to another location or a different context. You can change your name, or your address, or your possessions, or your job, or your partner, but you cannot change your true identity. There is one other definable group who in fact belong with the Kafirun. This group are the Munafiqun, that is, the people who say they are Muslim, but who in reality are Kafir, because they do not trust in Allah, and they do not follow the way of Muhammad, even though they know that it exists. The Munafiqun can often be recognized by their constant criticism and bad opinion of the Mu'minin. The Prophet Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, said that the Munafiqun have four main characteristics. Even if they do the prayer and fast Ramadan, when they speak, they tell lies. When they argue, they are abusive. When they make compromise, they act treacherously. And when they are trusted, they betray that trust. The Munafiqun are a part of the Dajjal system, and when the army of the Mahdi confronts the army of Dajjal, the individual, the Munafiqun will be with the followers of the Dajjal.